Welcome back to Historical Context. Today we conclude our Jamestown unit, and where we last left off, we were in the summer of 1623, and the Virginia Company was in a state of chaos, fighting amongst itself over their rights to the Jamestown colony. And if you'll recall from previous episodes, that company really was allowed to get large with the number of stakeholders it had, and so I'm sure that didn't help their situation. Relations between the natives and the colonists were dismal following the massacre of 1622, which we also discussed in a previous episode. In May of 1623, Captain William Tucker reaches a peace agreement with the Powhatan and Opechancanough, but it was a ruse. Tucker had a celebratory wine drinking assembled for the honor of the treaty, but the wine was poisoned, and when it was passed around, it ultimately ended up killing 200 natives, and an additional 50 natives were killed by the colonists. Opechancanough, who we've talked about for most of this unit, managed to escape. But the threats weren't limited to just the natives. In late 1622, Captain Nathaniel Butler, who was also the governor of Bermuda, visited Jamestown and wrote a critical essay on the affairs of Virginia. While we don't know why he did this, it's important to note that Bermuda was the only other colony in the Virginia Company, and it's quite possible that they may have wanted more attention and or resources. While we do not have access to Captain Butler's letter, we do have access to a response written by the Jamestown colonists entitled "The Virginia Planters' Answer to Captain Butler." In it, they point out the 10 criticisms made of the colony, and they provide some responses. It appears to actually have been written by the House of Burgesses, which was in session in early 1623. The complaints presented in the letter, at least responded to, were that the plantations were built on salt marshes, that the harbors were too shallow, that new arrivals to the colony were often homeless, that food costs were expensive due to the harsh winter, the houses were poorly constructed, the colony's defenses were insufficient, tobacco was the colony's only successful industry, and everything else was struggling. Henrico and Charles City were abandoned, with the plantations left to the natives. The local government was incompetent. And perhaps most startling, according to Captain Butler, 10,000 people had been brought to Jamestown, yet only 2,000 were alive. The respondents pointed out that the first 3 accusations were simply false. The high food costs and industry sufferings were blamed on the massacre. The houses were built by the men that lived in them. The last 3 accusations were left unanswered. Meanwhile, charges were being brought up against the Virginia Company itself. The affairs of the Virginia Company were placed under investigation in England in April 1623. Sir Nathaniel Rich in London requested a commission investigating the Virginia Company to look at the financial records and that, quote, all public letters which came from Virginia may be produced. So he wanted all correspondence investigated. The investigation was going to be difficult, considering the number of prominent people involved in the Virginia Company. In fact, in May of 1623 a list of members of the House of Commons who did not have interests in the Virginia Company was produced. Included on that list was Oliver Cromwell, whose namesake nephew would later make English history. So there were 53 people in the House of Commons who weren't involved in the Virginia Company. But by comparison, there were 450 elected to Parliament in 1624. Talk about a conflict of interest. Sometime in May or June, a letter was written to the commission discussing the conditions in Virginia. The letter stated that the colony had poor food provisions, excessive deaths due to those poor provisions, and poor housing, and that prices were skyrocketing. The letter went on to criticize the Virginia Company by stating the company's laws are set down with an affected brevity and with unlimited authority. The investigation continues through the summer of 1623 with several correspondents back and forth, including King James I being looped into some of those texts. I have provided links in the notes of this episode, but I will add that the writings and reading them are very difficult because they're in Old English. Prices in Jamestown continued to rise, and on August 31st, 1623, Governor Wyatt issued a proclamation of fixed prices for commodities and a second proclamation forbidding the sale of tobacco until all debts were paid off. On September 4th, another proclamation forbid trading of corn with the natives. The Privy Council in England, they're the ones investigating the Virginia Company, concluded its investigation on October 8th and issued a statement that can be found in the Acts of the Privy Council. There's an actual book of Acts. The council recommended that the government, quote, be reduced into the hands of a fewer number of governors, and that a new charter be issued with the new government structure. They further recommended that King James appoint the next governor. So you're moving away from this colony under a private company to a colony that has more English authority attached to it. But the investigations were not over. On October 24th, the council ordered a new investigation into the conditions of the Virginia colony. A letter written by the council was directed to John Harvey, John Porey, Abraham Percy, Samuel Matthews, and John Jefferson. You may remember John Jefferson throughout our unit. They were wanting information from these men, and let's look at what they were asking for. Quote, how many plantations there be, and which of them be public, and which private and particular? What people, men, women, and children, be in each plantation? What fortifications or what place is best to be fortified? What houses and how many? What cattle, what arms, corn, and other provision? So essentially they're asking for a full census and a full inventory of the Jamestown colony. And the council gathers this information from the winter of 1623 to the spring of 1624. Now, come the spring of 1624, the Virginia Company is teetering on the brink of failure and starts lobbying the House of Commons for assistance. And this is interesting considering the number of people in the House of Commons who have an economic interest in the Virginia Company. On April 28th, 1624, King James I weighed in on the matter in a letter to Parliament. Let's have a look. We do signify to our House of Commons that we hold it very unfit for the Parliament to trouble themselves with those matters, which can produce nothing but a further increase in schism and faction, and disturb the happy and peaceable proceeding of the Parliament, which we hope your cares shall concur with ours to bring to a good issue. As for these businesses of Virginia and the Bermudas, ourself have taken them to heart and will make it our own work to settle the quiet and welfare of those plantations, and will be ready to do anything that may be for the real benefit and advancement of them. So it sounds like King James is ready to take control of this situation, and he most certainly does. In May of 1624, King James I revokes the charter of the Virginia Company and makes Virginia a royal colony. The colonists, meanwhile, fear sweeping changes would come, including the elimination of the House of Burgesses, which, if you'll recall from previous episodes, and I won't give it away, had an interesting origin. One of the first decisions by James I was to retain Sir Francis Wyatt as the governor of Virginia, making him not only the last colonial governor, but the first royal governor of Virginia. In July, the king appointed a group of commissioners in England to oversee the colony. The commissioners held back ships from going to Virginia until the appropriate resolutions for new government were drafted and sent. The Solicitor General explained why in a letter. Let's have a look. The commissioners for Virginia conceive it very necessary for preventing such distractions and confusions in Virginia as might happen by various rumors and reports. So essentially here what the Solicitor General is saying is if we allow the ships to go over, you're all of a sudden going to have this problem of rumors and all these other things starting as the commercial traffic heads over, but no word from England comes in. So they held everybody back, and then when they got word from England, they sent stuff out. And it occurred on August 26, 1624. That's when the commission wrote directly to Governor Wyatt. And in the early part of the letter, the commission acknowledges the human cost of the colony. Let's have a look. The examination of the state of Virginia, who certified that most of the people, by sickness, famine, and massacres by the savages, were dead, though the country appeared fruitful and healthful. So it seems as if up until these last couple of years, people in England didn't quite have a full understanding of the human cost. When those rumors came back that so many people had died, that's when the investigations ramped up. And not to mention the Virginia Company was tearing itself apart. And so the English government stepped in. And they decided to make some of these changes to make Virginia a royal colony. While more changes may have been coming, on March 27, 1625, King James I died. He was succeeded by his son, Charles I. And this represents a good stopping point of our Jamestown unit because we talk about the end of the private company and the start of the royal colony, and also the end of King James I's reign, and now on to King Charles I. And Virginia is about to go through new settlements and new growth, and so we will come back to them at a later date. And so now we're going to shift over to New England. And many of you may think, well, with New England, Plymouth Colony must be first. But it actually isn't. there are some events that we want to visit prior to the founding of the Plymouth colony, and we'll do that next time on Historical Context.